So my name's Maeve, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about how agents tend to, effectively, they do a little bit of interpretation as you're asking them to do things, and it can lead to some mistakes that if you're operating at scale, you can end up with quite a lot of blah, blah, blah. Take a breath. Right. You can end up with lots of mistakes that are across your enterprise. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to put some guardrails around them to stop that from happening. So how did we get here? So about a year ago, I was building a genealogy app, and I was doing some research on my ancestors. And while I was using a coding agent to do it, I asked it to give me a list of my ancestors back, and what it gave me instead was my husband's. So not quite what I asked for, and not really what I wanted. So I started to play around with it, and I started to see that this kind of thing was happening quite regularly. And it wasn't just in the genealogy app, and it wasn't just on, I think I was using Kiro at the time. It was happening in quite a lot of them. And what it came down to was that the agents really were making decisions on my behalf without asking. They were making choices before I could intervene and get in front of them. It was really difficult to work out how to stop it, because you're not just trying to be very specific about what you want your agent to do. You're trying to program against some of the things that it has ingrained in its own nature. And as I said, it wasn't just for a genealogy. It was happening I was starting to see it day to day in my software experience as well. And it was getting very much happening when anyone or whenever you were working on anything to do with building software, it was starting to kick in. And as soon as it starts to get, for anyone building software, in a large enterprise company, you start to have problems that effectively you need to start with platform. Because if you're going to start changing how the developer experience is going to happen, you need that to be done in a way that doesn't add in friction and takes away the cost for the engineers. So what was I seeing? I mentioned one already, but here's a few others. So it gave me the list of ancestors from my husband, not quite what I wanted. When I asked it then to give me a report on the actual ancestors that it had found, I was a bit surprised when it mentioned that there was, I think it was 4 women and 10 men. And considering it was 7 couples, I was a little bit confused as to why I'd come up with that, right? I mean, this is back in the 1800s, not that progressive. So it then started, as I tweaked it, it started to use pronouns to help it out. So I decided to hide them. I deleted them from the file. And when I deleted them, it cited evidence that was no longer there, and it was a fresh window, it was fresh context. It made up the fact that there was terms in there that helped it, and it was basically lying about the evidence that it had. Once I then added in lots of rules, I got it to do what I wanted to, and it was actually firing correctly. But one of the occasions I did it, it came across a file that had the old data in it. And even though it knew what to do and had proved it knew what to do, it couldn't help itself. It had to take a shortcut because it is geared for forward motion, not interrupting an engineer, and taking shortcuts because it wants to spend as little as possible. So what it was starting to do was, if there was any level of bias in something it was using, it would propagate and multiply that bias through the system. Okay, so I'm not going to bore your genealogy anymore, I promise. This is really about software engineering. So let's take some examples then of what I was seeing and apply it really to more applicable things for software engineering. At the same time I was working on that, I was also working on an application we were building, starting to play around with using agents. We had a little bit of a spec, and effectively what we wanted was, it was a web application. It was some kind of, it had a date on it, that's what I remember, and we were very specific that we wanted the date to be stored in ISO format. We also were very specific that it was going to be used by global users. What it built was something that forced any user to use European format. So if you're going to go to an American area, you don't really need them filling it out the wrong way. So correct, but not what we wanted. Another example was when I was dealing with a live issue. I asked it to investigate an authentication bug. It looked at the logs. It did a good job. It looked really more at the symptoms than the actual cause, and even though I'd asked it for a report, what it actually did was it went and decided that the issue was that the tokens weren't long enough, and that it should actually change it on my behalf, commit the code, and come back and say, haha, it's done. Right, not the fix I would ever want, and I asked for a report not to fix it. And then another example, very similar to the file that the example I had found, we were building an application. It was having a new section of the website. There was going to be a new class of user that was going to use it. This case, we had done a load of work on the spec. The spec was super clear. It wanted a specific type of new user. It was very clear on the journey that it wanted to go on, but it came across a test file in the code base. And again, even though it knew what it was doing, it took a shortcut and it provided a test suite that didn't include the new users. Now that was really easy to spot because we knew we were adding in new users, so we were able to track that down quite quickly. The issue is when it's not easy to spot. When it looks right, the tests are passing, but it's missing something. And that can sometimes be a missed feature that comes back and bites you later, or it can actually be a problem where it might not work for certain users, et cetera, et cetera. So, guardrails. I mentioned it was really difficult. So the first thing I did was, as I think most people do, I asked the agent to help me out. So the agent created some rules. It was effectively going down the route of prioritize accuracy over completeness, state what you assumed. And it worked great. It stated everything that I got wrong, and then continued on its merry way. So that didn't work quite well, not exactly what I wanted. Next up, so I said, right, okay, well, can you stop, please? That didn't work. I said, ask before you continue. That was just a little bit too soft. It wasn't declarative enough. The second try that we did, which was stop and wait for confirmation, that worked an awful lot better. So that was more of an actual declarative gate that said, stop what you're doing. The next up was how do you get it to trigger? So within the skills themselves, there is front matter, which I'll go through in a little bit. But effectively, there's a section where it kind of says, this is when you use this skill. And the agent directed me to put in phrases. So it was along the lines of, when the user asks for X. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't say the same thing the same way every single time. So effectively, and if it's going to be used by lots of different people, you're not going to say things exactly the same way. So that didn't work very well. It works sometimes, but not all the time. Then I started going down the route of intent. So really what you should be putting in there is, what is the agent trying to do to make sure that it will then be able to match on how it's going to do it. That worked very well, except for the fact that every now and then, if I'd given it a big job, it forgot what it was doing in the moment. It also used different terminology. So a really good example was, I want you to analyze this data set. I want you to look across it and give me the percentage of the data set that is my husband's family rather than mine. It did all the wrong things, and when I queried it, it said, oh, I wasn't analyzing, I was counting. So the words that you're using there, the actual intent that matches what the agent thinks it's doing, needs a little bit of work. So overall, it took me quite a while to get the skills right for my genealogy app that I was actually happy with, and still I had that issue where it found the wrong file and ignored them anyway. So there's a difference in skills. You've got some that are effectively advisory. So you've got things like, here are my standards, here is how we build Kotlin components, here's our accessibility guidelines. Those are all advisory. You're asking the agent to follow these rules, and you're giving it context to say, when you're doing something, try and do it this way. The gated skills come in where you start to see a behavior that its own inherent behavior will not let it do what you've asked it to do. And we'll go through that in a little bit. It definitely needed to be intent-driven, whether it was advisory or gated skills. You needed to match it on intent rather than phrasing. And you need the skills to be appropriately sized. I think kind of earlier in the swarm session, they were talking about having the context boundary and having kind of small tasks so it knows what it's doing. If you put too much in your skills, you're giving it too much information, and it's not really going to end up doing what you want. So, let's try that again. Okay. So to step back a little bit, I mentioned loads of things earlier. I mentioned things like specs. I mentioned features that weren't built that you'd think, well, okay, you can figure that out when you're reviewing your code. You should spot that the feature isn't there, right? The human will spot it. The issue is if you have a lot of teams that are building software, some of them might spend time writing skills to make it a bit better. Some of them might spend a lot of time doing specs. You also need to train them how to do those things. So you could end up spending a lot of your time having really, really concrete specs, but even in the case where you have a really good spec, the agent still might not follow it anyway. So this slide is really kind of talking about the fact that you're really picking where you want to spend your energy and where you want to spend your cost. When you're working with large amounts of teams, you need to think about the developer experience. So how interrupt-driven is it going to be, that experience with them working with the agent? What is the risk of them letting something out there that's broken? What's the net effect of that? How much do you care about rework? If you're prototyping, you don't care that the agent did it wrong and that you look at it and go, I want to change that, that, and that. But if you're working on something that's important and you want to get it right first thing, then maybe you actually do care about rework and you want to make sure the agent is doing what you want. As we're starting to add more skills in, they are becoming the new code. So you don't just write a skill, you're going to have to test the skill. You're going to have to evaluate, is the skill doing what you want it to do? Is the skill still valuable? Is it even being fired in the first place? And how do you actually apportion value to it as to what the net effect of not doing it would have been? Okay. So I'm going to ground us in a bit of a scenario, just kind of bring this to life a little bit. So this is a team. This is a company building a website. They sell lots of products. It's one of the things that they do. They have lots of people. Let's say 200 teams are out there. They're kind of team topology oriented. You've got a bunch of web teams, each building their own thing. You've got a bunch of back-end teams building the APIs that serve the things that they're building. They have a platform team. They have a way of building, let's say, a micro-vanilla front-end or a back-end or something. They've put effort into making sure that when an engineer is building something from scratch, it is riding on the shoulders of everyone that came behind them, and they're building stuff that's already built. They're not reinventing the wheel. So they've got a scaffolding service. They've got a component library, they've got a service catalog, they've got MCP. I'm not going to go into too much detail of these, it's just to give a bit of a backdrop to the context. So we have a new engineer that's arrived in, and they are tasked with, we need this product detail page, but we need it in orange and black. There's a campaign that's running, orange and black is the new colors that we want. We don't want to use the main website, we want it to be specifically tracked a different way. Just create a micro front end for us. Use the items in the component library, use the bits that you need, and create it. So the engineer sits down and says, right, well, how am I going to do that? Well, the platform team has made available to them in the NPM registry some packages that it can use. So the first thing it's going to use is there's a create app that it's going to use. That create app has, I'll get to that in a second. So it's going to use the create app, right? But they also have platform Claude config available that the platform team has put together. They have an MCP server where you have a bunch of standards like use, I don't know, React for the front end, use Apogee for your gateway, et cetera, They have a design system metadata in there that they have all of the components that they want, like the picker, the lovely picture of the shoes, the bit that changes the different variant from a sizing perspective, et cetera. And they have all of that accessible through Backstage. So they run their create app, and the create app is doing a bunch of stuff, again, fairly basic scaffolding that a platform team would provide, where it's going to create a repo for you and it's going to have everything that you need to be able to start with your vanilla app. And because it's in an agentic company that are actually doing things like skills and hooks, it has everything you need. So when you open up your VS Code or whatever you're using, you're able to start actually asking your agent how to write this code. You're going to be able to give it a prompt and get it to build for you. It's got skills in there, it's got some hooks, it's got config and tests. So what do they look like? Okay, so when we talk about skills, you've got the prompt surface. So you've got what the user is asking the agent to do, any of the files and context you've made available to it, and any of the skills that tell it how to do certain things. You have the routing to those files, where you have, I mentioned earlier, front matter, that tells you what is the operation the agent needs to be doing in order to invoke this. And then you have the harness surface. So the top bit of it, the prompt surface and the prompts, they're all soft. Please, Mr. Agent, could you do this thing? The harness surface is hard. So where you can deterministically figure out that it hasn't done it, put something in to stop it doing that. So for example, if you've said, all of our components are supposed to come from the component library, and there's an import in the file that doesn't look like they've done that, you can put in a pre-tool use hook for the agent so it stops it and it won't actually allow it to make that code. So let's have a look at some examples of these. So this is really, really tiny writing, but you've got an accessibility skill that basically says, go look at the standards and follow them. So it's advisory, it's just telling you, go get your standards. The second one then is the actual standard where it says things like, I don't know, normal text is 4.5, all interactive elements are accessible on a keyboard, etc., etc. So a lot of your advisory skills are going to be pointers to data that you have elsewhere so that you're able to maintain it and not have it scattered across your repos. And the last one here is the hook. So again, I've mentioned it earlier. This particular one is deny if you're including an import that you shouldn't. So again, deterministic. You can actually tell from the code it's producing that it's going to do the wrong thing. So we've got our engineer. He's going to build a lovely orange and black version of the website. We've set everything up for him. He has an access to VS Code where he can put a prompt in. The agent is already there and waiting. The agent knows what you're following from a standards perspective. It knows all of the things it's supposed to do. What could go wrong? It's going to do it perfectly, isn't it? Right. Not so much. So the examples that we came across first, overreaching was one of the biggest things. So it turned out that the links that we had to our standards were broken. They didn't exist. So it made some standards up and followed that instead. There was a tracking utility. So there was a standard about how all pages have to have certain things tracking on the page for analytics. Couldn't find it. And again, I think it just decided not to do it at all. So it created the page and there was no tracking in it whatsoever. So that was a missing requirement. The other interesting one was when one of the runs, when it couldn't find what it needed, it worked out, it tried to backward work out where the repository would be that it was in, discovered it was on the engineer's computer, and went and looked at the source there instead. So laterally looking in places it shouldn't. The driving force of the agent is to try and solve the problem by itself without interrupting the user. So it does end up with some behaviors. The other big thing was, I think we've all seen it before, fabrication. So it makes stuff up, it hallucinates. So in this particular case, with that example, it hard-coded the URL itself. It invented the campaign slug that we would want. It didn't ask. It added in tests. The tests were passing, so we're passing on a value we didn't want. It also, again, this could be almost classed as overreaching, but the product ID on the page, this is a product detail page, there's a product API that it's going to call. It wanted it to be one value. Now, if I was building it, I would want it to, I don't have it as a parameter so it works for all products, but it assumed that you'd only want this to be valuable for one product, and it didn't have a product ID, so it queried the MCP, found the API, went through all of the calls to the API until it found one that gave product information and then grabbed one of those values and put that in and decided that's what it was going to do. So again, a lot of these you could spot, but the issue often is that when it's talking about what it's doing, there's a huge amount of information that's coming up on your screen. So again, in the swarming example, it talks about different agents. A lot of the IDEs now, they all delegate their own tasks. And what happens is the agent itself is, the sub-agent is saying what it's doing, and then it gives a summary of what it's doing to the parent agent, and then the parent agent summarizes it back to you. And you can see that sometimes in your IDE that this is happening. But when the parent agent finishes, it hides all of that from you. So if you're not at your desk looking at it, doing it, you're not going to see all of the things that it decided on your behalf. And it doesn't turn up in the chat afterwards. But what it does do is it does turn up in some of the transcripts. This is a lot in this slide that none of you can see, so I'm going to talk to a lot of it. Right. So to your point about if you want to have a better spec, if you want to have better ways of blocking this, the first thing you need to do is actually notice what it's doing. So in some cases, when an agent is doing something, if you can see a repeated behavior, you need to add something in to stop it doing that repeated behavior. So I talked earlier about gates. This is an example. So this is called the selecting a value skill. You have your front matter saying whenever you're committing a concrete value, an ID, a path, a key, a default, or a configuration file that the task requires but was not explicitly provided, stop and ask the user. So before you write any code that commits any value you were not explicitly given, stop and declare it. I'll get into these bits in a minute, but basically stop and declare it. So we put this into our ecosystem, we added in the skill, and we worked out that we needed to be able to measure the value. So is it doing what we actually wanted to do? And do we know that it's firing? So the first thing we had to do was actually add in another skill, which was when you're doing these things, put logs in your transcript so we can tell. So we started to have a lot more information coming through in the on Claude specifically. I think it's in your users folder called projects. There's transcripts from every time that you're using Claude in there that are a bit more detailed than what you see in the chat. So we started making sure that it started putting information in there. So list every required value now handed to you, give it the field that it's set, give it the value you'd use, tell you where you got it from, so that we had more information in the actual transcripts itself so we could see what it was doing. But these are things that you're adding in. You're potentially interrupting the user when the user wants to do the work that it's doing. So you need to actually measure the impact it's having, not just from a did it do what you wanted to, but what was the actual impact on the developer experience. So we started adding in another hook and another skill. I think if I click on this somewhere, possibly. So we added in some more hooks, and what we did was we started getting the transcripts, and whenever you were pushing code, that was the point where we decided you were kind of finished done with your session, you're pushing code through to your repository. We had two different types of evals that we would do. So one was on pre-push, and that was very cheap. It was deterministically, in the output, we're looking for these specific things, and we're going to score them, and we're going to work out what the impact of that is. But you can only find the things that you're looking for if you know about them and you know how they're going to turn up in that transcript. So on a weekly basis, we would have things fire. So again, on people's machines, because we didn't, the transcripts are not, they're not masked or anything, so there could be information in there that you don't want to have given to somebody else. So we kept it on the local machines, but we fired off stuff into an eval store that was summaries. So one was on pre-push, and that happened all the time. That it was cheap. We had another one then that happened in weekly, and that was more looking at using an LLM based on the actual interactions between the user and the agent. How did it work? How much back and forth was there? How many turns were there? How many times did the user sound frustrated? So things like that, so we could get a little bit more insight into what other problems we actually had. As soon as we had a problem, this was fairly obvious, we would then add in a skill and a matching eval specifically for that skill. So we would then have counts that were coming back to us that were firing into our eval store that told us a little bit of information about how these skills worked. So it had to declare what skill it was using so we could tell how many times the skill was used. It had to put in the items that we had in here as well so that we would be able to track it. And we started to do it, seeing some interesting stats. So things like prompts to the user. In this particular case, the very first time we put that skill in, it asked 4 questions. And when it answered the first question, it then kept going because it figured, I've asked a question, I can just go ahead. So we had to put in this bit down here, which was stop and ask about every inferred you have and bundle them all together and wait for the user to tell you all 4. And what it did to the metrics was really, really interesting. So we went from having no questions to originally 4 questions back to 1 question. We had round trips that were going, and what was really interesting was his active minutes. So the active minutes, the very first time before we had the skill that said, ask me questions, it was 24 minutes in total, and 14 of those 24 minutes was rework. So we did a 10-minute chunk, building all of the wrong stuff, and then the user went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until it got what it needed. Whereas the other version was 17. So it was 17 active minutes. But what was also interesting was that look at the token count. Sorry, you can't see that. It's 53,000 versus 39,000. So what we were finding was, as soon as we put in the stop and ask me everything, it was better for the user because they weren't having this interrupt driven of, I've answered, it starts again, I've answered, I've started again. But it meant that it waited a lot longer to ask the questions and read an awful lot more things it probably didn't need to. So there's a fine balance between how you're actually putting the right stuff in. But effectively what we ended up with was you have gated skills to stop a specific behavior. Wait for the problem before you start to try and solve it and create a gate for that. Have a linked eval for that so you can measure and regression test against new models that it's still firing. Have something that's a little bit looser, that's looking at the general content that you're doing on a sample basis because it's more expensive. So you can start to see what's the outcome of these skills. Are we still building the right way? Because again, looking at these numbers, these are just signals. If you have a team where it doesn't matter it's doing the wrong thing, then you don't need to put this in. If you're doing, going back to the kind of question from earlier, if you want to spend a lot more time putting in more specs, well, that might be what you want to end up doing. But then you have to teach people how to write specs as well. And if you're putting that across multiple teams, you probably need an eval there as well, or at least some rules in, are the specs following the right standard? So, Platform wasn't the only one who wanted to create skills, but we wanted to do it in such a way that other people would learn from the lessons that we had, and they didn't take a load of time to figure it out, and they didn't add in skills that were done the wrong way. So we then created a package, because Platform was now skills distribution, a mechanism for evaluating the value of the skill, and now also it was an authoring service. So Platform was responsible for the shape of what we would put in there. It knew the taxonomy of operations that it had come across. It knew roughly the kind of questions you'd want to ask depending on the operation. And it knew how to kind of put that together in a way that would be really easy for somebody to come along. Now, if they came across an operation that didn't already exist, then all they needed to do was do a PR into the repository and suggest, this is an operation I don't see here, it's not on the list, I need to be able to do X, Y, and Z, and they would come and help them out and get that up and running. But effectively what it meant was there was a few curated skills coming from Platform that we felt everyone needed to have. And then we had the ability for engineers to add anything else themselves where it didn't really matter whether it was going to everybody or not. So after all of that, and conscious I'm between you and lunch, the 3 takeaways are catch the assumptions up front. You can spend a lot of time doing specs, you can spend a lot of time doing code reviews, but if you can catch the assumptions right in front of you as they're happening, it is cheaper in the long run to try and stop them there and then. If you are halting them, we need to halt them on the cognitive operation, and then you need to pair those with actual evaluations of, is the halt working, is it adding friction, is it doing what you need it to do? And whether it's platform owned or not, I think this was originally for a platform conference, so that's why it says make it platform owned. It doesn't really matter, but I think the main thing is if you're going to scale this out across multiple teams, you need a service and you need a bit of curation, you need a bit of ownership around how this is done so that teams have something to follow rather than reinventing the wheel. Okay, I think that is it from me. Thank you very much.